My name is Harper Langford. At 34 years old, I did the one thing my entire family told me would finally prove them right about me. I spent every last dollar I had, $18,400 I'd saved over 11 long, exhausting years, buying back the crumbling old Langford family farmhouse they had abandoned and called a complete money pit for 17 years. The day I sat in that tiny title company conference room in Maple Ridge, the air felt thick with judgment. My whole family had shown up uninvited, like they were attending a funeral. My mother, Lorraine, sat directly across from me with her purse clutched tightly in her lap, ready to bolt at any second. My father, Garrett Langford, stood by the window with his back to me, staring out at nothing the way he always did when he was disappointed. And my older brother Ryan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, wearing that familiar smirk that had followed me since childhood. I had a cashier's check for the full amount right in front of me. Every penny. The escrow officer slid the deed across the table, and my mother spoke first, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut. "Harper, you're throwing your life away again." My father didn't even turn around. Real Langfords build something that lasts. They don't go digging through other people's failures. Ryan let out that low, mocking laugh I knew too well. "You really are a hopeless failure, aren't you, Harper?" I uncapped the pen. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything they said. I signed my name carefully, the way I'd been trained to do with important documents my whole life. The escrow officer cleared her throat and asked if I wanted the recorded deed mailed or emailed. "Both, please," I said softly. My family filed out without another word. My father never once looked at me. Through the window, I watched their 3 vehicles pull out of the parking lot, Dad's truck leading Ryan's SUV behind it and Mom's sedan bringing up the rear. 3 sets of taillights disappearing down the county road toward the life that had never really had space for me. I sat there alone for a long time with the deed in my hands and my bank account now showing exactly $63.47. There was no version of this story where I got my money back, no safety net. No family door left open. I had already won the only argument that mattered to me and lost everyone in that room in the process. If you've ever felt like the black sheep in your own family, the one they point to when they need someone to blame for not fitting their perfect picture, you already know how heavy that moment feels. Like the final confirmation of everything they've whispered about you for years. But here's what they didn't know that day. Something much bigger than their judgment was waiting for me just 10 minutes outside town, behind a steel door no one had opened in decades. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, the place where we talk about the quiet battles women fight in their own families, the ones that test every boundary we've ever tried to set. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and finally choosing yourself, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from right now. And if this already hits close to home, hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because what I found 1 week later didn't just change my life, it rewrote the story my family had spent 2 generations telling about itself. And the night I finally spoke the truth at my father's own Citizen of the Year gala, the entire room went completely silent. That afternoon after the signing, I drove out to the farmhouse alone. The late sun was hitting the peeling white paint in a way that made the old place look almost beautiful for a moment, almost. I sat in my car for a long time just staring at it, wondering if I had truly lost my mind like they all believed. But deep down, something in me knew this was the first real choice I had made in years that felt completely mine. No one was coming to save me, no one was cheering me on, it was just me, $63 and a deed with my name on it, and somehow that felt like the beginning of everything. People in Maple Ridge had always seen in me Langford who couldn't keep anything together, the quiet daughter, the one who tried too hard and still fell short. But the truth was much heavier and much lonelier. For 6 years I had been the one keeping the books for Langford Timber and Holdings, my father's company that built half the roads and subdivisions in the county. I was good at it, really good. Numbers had always made sense to me in a way people never did. I could spot a discrepancy from across the room, and I took pride in making sure everything was clean, accurate, and above board. My father even used to say I had the Langford eye for detail, until the day that compliment quietly disappeared. It was 2019, a big land deal on the edge of the county. Ryan needed me to record some numbers that didn't match the actual transfers. I flagged it twice, in writing, with dates and everything. I told him it wasn't right. He told me I didn't understand how big deals worked, that sometimes things had to breathe. When the state auditors came asking questions months later, every questionable entry had my initials on it. Ryan's name was nowhere to be found. My father chose to believe his son. I still remember sitting in his office, the smell of fresh coffee and pine from the lumber yard drifting through the window, while he looked at me with something between disappointment and exhaustion. "Family closes ranks, Harper. You know that. That was the line I grew up hearing whenever I stepped out of place. It always meant the same thing: protect the name, even if it means sacrificing the truth, even if it means sacrificing me." I didn't fight it the way I should have. Fighting your own family in public felt like setting fire to the only home you've ever known, so I left quietly. I hung my own small shingle, Langford Bookkeeping, in a little rented office on 2nd Street. For 2 years I did honest work for honest people, local contractors, small farms, single moms trying to keep their businesses afloat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. It almost held. Then my largest client, a contractor who owed me nearly 8 months of fees, filed for bankruptcy. He took my margins, my savings buffer, and most of my pride with him. I closed the office in March with nothing but a stack of unpaid invoices and the heavy weight of another failure my family could point to. If you've ever carried other people's mistakes like they were rent you owed, you know exactly how that feels. I was the kind of woman who read the fine print twice and still apologized for taking up space. Over-responsible, my old boss used to call it. That same quality that once made me valuable to my father now made me the perfect scapegoat. My family never saw it as a strength. They saw it as weakness because it always worked in their favor. I carried the blame so they didn't have to. I fixed the messes so the Langford name stayed shining. And every time I tried to step out on my own, they reminded me, sometimes with silence, sometimes with words, that I wasn't built for anything bigger than supporting their vision. That's why when my cousin Travis slid into the booth at the diner one rainy afternoon and told me about the old family farmhouse being sold cheap by a distant relative who just wanted it gone, something in me listened. The place had sat empty for 17 years, a crumbling reminder of better days. Travis said the land alone was worth more than the asking price. He made it sound like the perfect fresh start for someone like me. I should have asked why he was so eager to help. I did ask, eventually, but the real answer took me weeks to uncover. Looking back now, I realized that moment in the title company wasn't just about buying a house. It was the first time I chose myself knowing full well they would punish me for it. I had $63 to my name and a ruined reputation in the town my family ruled, but for the first time in years I also had something that felt like possibility. If you've ever had your own family tell you exactly what you'll never become, you already understand how that voice follows you into every quiet room. It whispers when you're trying to sleep. It echoes when you're standing alone in a dusty old farmhouse wondering if they were right all along. Stay with me, because that farmhouse was hiding more than just broken walls and old memories. It was holding the kind of truth that could either destroy what was left of my family or finally set me free. And I was about to open the door they had sealed shut decades ago. Travis Mercer had always been the family's smooth talker, the one who flipped houses, made deals in the shadows, and somehow always landed on his feet. He found me at the little diner on the edge of town one Tuesday afternoon, sliding into the booth across from me like we were old friends catching up. "Harper, I've got something perfect for you," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "The old Langford farmhouse. It's been sitting there rotting since your grandpa passed. The distant cousins back east just want it gone. Asking price is only $18,400. Land alone is worth way more." He leaned in, voice low and convincing. "This could be your fresh start, a place that's actually tied to the family name but finally yours." I should have been suspicious. Travis had done small jobs for my father over the years, and he had that same calculated charm Ryan used when he wanted something. But at that point I was desperate for any door that would open. My savings were drying up, my reputation in town was in tatters, and the idea of owning something, anything that couldn't be taken away from me, felt like oxygen. Still, I didn't jump. That's not who I am. I went home that night and made a plan on my legal pad, the way I always did when the anxiety got loud. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office and pulled the full title history myself, going back to the 1930s. It was clean, no liens, no messy disputes. I called the state environmental department about the old well and septic system. Everything checked out. I walked the property 3 separate times, notebook in hand. The house was rough, peeling paint, sagging porch, windows boarded up, but the bones felt solid. I even paid $250 I could barely afford for a retired inspector named Pete to give me a quick structural look. He said the foundation was surprisingly strong and the roof was the biggest liability. Everything added up. The price was low because the place looked like a money pit and sat on an old country road most people had forgotten. The sellers were tired heirs who lived out of state. The math made sense. On the day I told Travis I was paying cash and skipping the inspection contingency he had suggested, his smile stretched a little too wide. "Smart girl," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Then he stepped outside the diner to make a phone call I couldn't quite hear. If you've ever been in that moment where something feels too good to be true, but you're so tired of being small that you take the chance anyway, you know the mix of hope and fear I was carrying. This wasn't just a house to me, it was proof that I could build something without their permission. That I could own land with my own name on the deed, not just live in the shadow of the Langford legacy. I signed anyway. Looking back, that decision was the turning point, not because it was easy, it was terrifying, but because it was the first time I trusted my own judgment more than their voices. Even with only $63 left in my account after closing, I drove away from the title company feeling something I hadn't felt in years: possibility. The farmhouse wasn't beautiful yet, it was broken, neglected, and full of ghosts, but it was mine, completely, legally, undeniably mine. And something inside those old walls had been waiting a very long time for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to open them. Stay with me, because that first night I stepped inside with nothing but a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. I had no idea I was about to knock on a wall that would change everything my family thought they knew about our history. The first night I officially owned the farmhouse, I drove out there alone just as the sun was dipping behind the hills. The sky had that soft golden pink glow you only see in the countryside, but it didn't make the place look welcoming. It looked lonely. The old white two-story house sat back from the quiet county road, paint peeling in long strips, porch sagging like it was tired of holding itself up for 17 years. I parked my Civic in the gravel drive, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a few minutes with the windows down. The only sounds were crickets and the occasional breeze moving through the tall grass. No traffic, no neighbors close enough to hear if something went wrong. Just me in this big broken house that now had my name on the deed. I grabbed my flashlight, a thermos of strong coffee, and the crowbar I'd thrown in the trunk just in case. My hands were cold even though the evening wasn't. I let myself in with the key the escrow officer had given me in a plain yellow envelope. The front door creaked loud enough to make my heart jump. Inside, the air was heavy, that unmistakable smell of old wood, damp earth, and years of being sealed shut. Dust floated in the beam of my flashlight as I walked through the main rooms. The kitchen still had the old cast-iron sink and cabinets that had seen better decades. The living room had faded wallpaper with patterns from the 1970s. Everything felt frozen in time, like the house had been holding its breath since my grandfather passed. I saved the cellar for last. The wooden door to the basement stairs was swollen from moisture, but it opened after a firm push. I shone the light down the narrow stone steps. Cool air rose up to meet me, carrying a deeper scent, something earthy and old like wet stone mixed with faint oak. My footsteps echoed as I went down, 12 steps. At the bottom, the cellar stretched out bigger than I expected. Stone walls, low-arched ceiling, and a dirt floor packed hard from decades of use. I walked slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the space. Old shelves lined one wall, mostly empty except for a few rusted tools and broken crates. In the far corner, behind a pile of rotten lumber and collapsed shelving, something caught my eye. A section of the back wall looked different. The paneling there was newer than the rest, cheap 1980s wood that didn't match the rest of the cellar's age. I knocked on it gently. The sound was wrong, hollow, not the normal hollow of an empty wall cavity, deeper, like there was space behind it. A cool draft whispered from the seam where the paneling met the stone floor, steady, almost like the house was breathing out after holding something in for a very long time. I stood there for what felt like forever, hand pressed against that cheap paneling, heart beating hard in my chest. Part of me wanted to pry it open right then. Another part, the careful, over-responsible part that had kept me alive this long, told me to wait, to document, to think. If you've ever stood in a quiet, dark place and felt like the walls were hiding something important, you know that strange mix of fear and curiosity. My family had always called me too cautious, too slow to see the big picture, but in that moment that caution felt like protection. I took photos from every angle. I wrote down the time, the date, the exact location of the hollow spot. I measured the section with an old tape measure I found upstairs. Then I went back up the stairs, locked the front door, and sat on the porch for a long time, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm. That night, back in my small apartment, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that hollow knock and felt that cool draft on my ankles. The farmhouse wasn't just an old building I'd bought on a desperate hope. It felt like it was waiting, like something behind that wall had been sealed away on purpose. And for the first time since signing the papers, I didn't feel like a hopeless failure. I felt like I was on the edge of something much bigger than me. Stay with me, because the next afternoon I went back with a plan and a crowbar, and what I found behind that false wall changed the entire story of my family. The next afternoon I drove back to the farmhouse with a crowbar in the trunk, a legal pad full of notes, and a determination I hadn't felt in years. The voice in my head, the one that sounded a lot like my father and Ryan, kept whispering that I was being dramatic, that it was probably just an old crawl space or rotten insulation. But I couldn't let it go. That hollow sound and the cool draft had stayed with me all night. I made myself a clear plan first, sitting at the old kitchen counter with my coffee. Roof repairs later, windows after that, power whenever I could afford it. For now, I just needed to know what I was dealing with. I hauled out some of the collapsed shelving from the cellar, sweeping decades of dust and grit. The smell of damp earth grew stronger as I worked, mixed with that faint trace of old oak I couldn't quite place. By late afternoon, I stood in front of the suspicious section of paneling, crowbar in hand. My heart was racing, but my hands were steady. I told myself I'd only remove one panel to look, just one. The first sheet came away with a loud screech of old nails, sending a cloud of dust into the air. A rush of cooler air rolled across my feet, heavier now, carrying a deeper scent, something aged and sealed away. Behind the cheap 1980s paneling was no ordinary wall. There was a solid poured concrete barrier, and set right into it was a heavy steel door, not a regular basement door. This was a thick riveted slab with a rotary bolt handle, the kind you'd see on an old bank vault or secure storage room from the 1940s. It had been painted over multiple times and then deliberately hidden. I stood there, frozen, flashlight beam shaking slightly across the metal surface. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal this, first with concrete, then with paneling on top. My mind raced through all the possibilities, but nothing prepared me for the weight of what this might mean. If you've ever had your family tell you your whole life that you can't see the big picture, that you're too careful, too slow, too small for anything important, you know how powerful that moment feels. Here I was, the hopeless failure they all laughed about, standing in front of something clearly hidden on purpose, and for once my careful nature felt like the exact right response. I didn't try to open the door that night. Instead, I did what I do best. I documented everything. I took dozens of photos from every angle. I wrote down the exact time, the condition of the seals, the measurements of the door, and the surrounding concrete. I even sketched it out on my legal pad. Then I carefully put the paneling back in place as best I could, covered the area with a tarp I found upstairs, and locked the house. Driving home that evening, my thoughts were spinning. The farmhouse wasn't just a neglected family property. It had secrets, real ones. And I was the only person alive who knew this steel door even existed. That knowledge felt both terrifying and strangely empowering. Back in my apartment, I stayed up late researching old property records and the history of the land. The original owner in the 1930s and 40s was a man named Elias Whitaker. He had run a small private bank for local farmers during the Depression and was known for careful, secure storage practices. The cellar had apparently been reinforced for a reason. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by printouts, the weight of it all settling on my shoulders. My family had written this place off as worthless. They had mocked me for buying it. But something important, something valuable enough to hide behind steel and concrete, had been waiting here for decades. That night I made myself a promise. Whatever was behind that door, I would face it the way I should have faced everything else in my life, with patience, with proof, and without rushing into their noise. They had always underestimated me. This time their underestimation might be the very thing that set me free. Stay with me, because 2 days later I returned with penetrating oil tools and the courage to finally turn that rotary handle. What I found when that heavy steel door finally swung open didn't just shock me, it shattered everything I thought I knew about my own family's legacy. 2 days later, I went back to the farmhouse carrying more than just tools. I had spent the previous night and most of the morning deep in research at my kitchen table. Old county records, newspaper archives from the 1930s and 40s, anything I could find about Elias Whitaker and the property. What I learned painted a clearer picture. Whitaker wasn't just a farmer. He operated a small but trusted private bank and secure storage service for local families during the hardest years of the Depression. People brought him gold coins, important documents, even cash when the banks in the city couldn't be trusted. The reinforced cellar had been built specifically for that purpose. That knowledge made the steel door feel even heavier. I arrived in the early afternoon with penetrating oil, a set of wrenches, gloves, and my phone set to record. The house was quiet except for the wind moving through the loose boards upstairs. I went straight down into the cellar, removed the paneling again, and stood in front of that heavy steel door. My heart was pounding, but my mind was calm. I had promised myself I would do this carefully, no rushing, no emotion clouding my judgment. It took nearly 2 hours of patient work. I worked the rotary bolt loose inch by inch, spraying oil, waiting, turning. The metal groaned like it hadn't moved in generations. When the handle finally gave way with a deep echoing click, I stepped back. The door swung inward just a couple of inches at first, then stopped. A rush of cool, aged air poured out. Oak, old paper, time. I shone my flashlight inside. Stone steps continued downward, deeper than the main cellar. I counted 12 more steps as I descended carefully, phone recording every moment. The smell wrapped around me completely now. Charred oak, dry paper, and something sweeter, almost like aged wood and secrets long kept. At the bottom, the space opened into a larger hidden chamber. Stone walls, a vaulted brick ceiling, and wooden racks running the length of the room. On those racks sat dozens of wooden crates, carefully packed and sealed. I lifted the lid of the nearest one with trembling hands. Inside were rows of carefully wrapped items, rare gold coins, old stock certificates from companies that no longer existed, bundles of currency from the 1930s and 40s, and most importantly, thick leather-bound ledgers and folders of original documents. I didn't cheer. I didn't call anyone. I simply stood there in the cool silence, letting the weight of it settle over me. This wasn't random junk hidden away. This was someone's life savings and records, deliberately protected and then deliberately concealed. If you've ever had a moment where the ground feels like it shifts under your feet, where everything you thought you knew about your own story starts to crack open, you understand what I felt in that chamber. My family had called this place a worthless money pit. They had laughed at me for buying it. And here I was, the so-called hopeless failure, standing in the middle of something that could change everything. But I knew better than to get lost in the excitement. Treasures like this only become real with proof. So instead of touching more than I needed to, I started doing what I do best. I became the careful bookkeeper again. I photographed every crate, every label, every visible document. I logged details in a spreadsheet on my phone. I made sure not to disturb the scene more than necessary. Later that evening, back at my apartment, I reached out to 2 reputable auction houses that specialized in historical financial instruments and Depression-era artifacts. I was careful in my email, identifying myself as the verified legal owner and asking exactly what kind of authentication and provenance they would need. One of them replied within hours, clearly very interested. They wanted high-resolution photos, detailed inventories, and any original paperwork tying the items to Elias Whitaker. That's when I knew I had to go back down and look even more carefully, not just for the valuables, but for the paper trail that would make this legitimate. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about my family. They had no idea what was sitting under the old farmhouse they had dismissed so easily. They still saw me as the weak link, the daughter who couldn't get anything right, but something had shifted inside me. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving their judgment. I was preparing to rewrite the story they had controlled for so long. Stay with me, because the next night I found the strongbox behind the old desk in the hidden chamber, and what was inside those documents didn't just reveal a fortune, it exposed the original lie that built my family's entire legacy. The next evening, I returned to the hidden chamber with fresh eyes and a more focused purpose. I wasn't just looking for treasure anymore, I was looking for truth. The old wooden desk pushed against the far stone wall had been bolted to the floor, almost like it was guarding something. I worked the edges carefully and discovered a small iron door set into the stone at knee height. It took nearly an hour of gentle persuasion with tools and patience before the rusted hinge finally gave way. Inside was a brass-cornered strongbox, heavy and green with age. I carried it upstairs to the kitchen counter where the light was better and opened it with a slow creak. The smell of old paper that had stayed dry for decades filled the room. Inside were neatly organized folders, ledgers, manifests, and official-looking documents tied with faded ribbon. I started reading. The first papers were from Elias Whitaker's private bank, detailed records of deposits from local farmers in the 1930s and 1940s, gold coins, savings, important family deeds. But deeper in the box, folded carefully in oilcloth, were the two documents that stopped my breathing. A promissory note dated 1946 written in my grandfather's own handwriting, and a bill of transfer dated 1947 signed by Elias Whitaker on his deathbed. Stapled behind them was a county notice showing the final transfer of assets. I read the buyer's name 3 times before my mind would accept it: Harlan Langford, my grandfather. The note revealed everything. My grandfather had loaned Whitaker a significant sum during his final illness at terms that were predatory even for that era. When Whitaker passed shortly after, my grandfather used the debt to seize not just the land and house but the entire contents of the hidden vault. The official story my family had told for 2 generations was that my grandfather had saved the Whitaker property through honest business. The papers in my hands proved it was a quiet, calculated takeover. I sat on the kitchen floor with those documents in my lap for a long time, the flashlight beam casting long shadows across the old planks. This wasn't just a hidden fortune. This was the original sin my family's entire empire had been built upon. The wealth, the respect, the Citizen of the Year awards, it all rested on a lie my grandfather had carefully buried behind steel and concrete. And every Langford since had either known or chosen not to look too closely. If you've ever discovered that the foundation of your family's pride was built on something dishonest, you know the strange grief that hits you. Part of me felt anger. Another part felt almost relieved. For years they had pointed at me as the weak one, the failure. Now I held proof that their greatness had started with a theft they had hidden from the world, and from me. But I didn't rush to confront them. That's not how I work. Instead, I did what I've always done best. I became meticulous. I photographed every single page, front and back. I created a detailed digital inventory. I scanned the most important originals at a copy shop 2 towns over. Then I drove the physical documents to a bank in the next county, one my family had never done business with, and placed them in a safe deposit box under my name only. I contacted the auction house again with the new evidence. Their expert responded almost immediately, clearly excited. The combination of the physical assets and this unbroken chain of documented provenance made the collection extremely valuable. Their preliminary estimates started climbing well into 7 figures. For the first time since buying the farmhouse, I allowed myself 5 quiet minutes to feel the weight of what this meant. Me, the daughter they called hopeless, sitting on something that could rewrite our family story. But I knew excitement was dangerous. A number that large doesn't protect you, it makes you a target. I had seen what my family would do over small pieces of land and minor business disputes. I knew exactly what they would try to do once they learned about this, so I kept working. I reached out to a lawyer in a neighboring county who had no connection to the Langford name. I got a clear title opinion in writing. I began quietly exploring a partnership with a developer who specialized in restoring historic properties. Every step was careful, every document was another layer of protection. My family still thought I was the same scared girl who always folded when they applied pressure. They had no idea I was building something they couldn't tear down with words or threats. Stay with me, because within days of my discovery the circling began. Travis showed up first, then Ryan, then my parents with their casseroles and calculated concern. They could smell that something had changed, and they were ready to bring the family asset back under their control. But this time I wasn't planning to hand them anything. The circling started faster than I expected. 3 days after I found the strongbox, Travis showed up unannounced while I was hauling some old lumber out to the side of the house. His truck rolled slowly up the gravel drive like he belonged there. He tried to look casual, but his eyes kept darting toward the open cellar door I hadn't fully hidden yet. "What you got going on down there, Harper?" he asked, too friendly, too interested. "Place looks like you've been busy." I'd grown up around practiced liars. I knew exactly what a man sounded like when he already suspected the truth and was fishing to see how much I would give him. I smiled politely and told him it was just an old utility space full of mold and junk, nothing worth worrying about. He nodded, but he kept glancing back at the house as we talked. Before he left, he made one last comment. "You did real good getting this place so cheap. Almost too good, huh?" Then he sat in his truck for a full minute after pulling away, talking on his phone with animated hand gestures. I watched from the window and felt the shift. This wasn't coincidence anymore. 2 days later, Ryan arrived. He came in his good boots and company jacket, walking the property like he was already pricing it for resale. He didn't bother with small talk. Heard you've been poking around the old place, he said. Holdings would be willing to take it off your hands at a fair price. Keep it in the family where it belongs. You don't need this kind of headache. When I quietly said no, the mask dropped, the concern vanished. You don't understand, he said, voice low. This land has history with our family, Grandpa's history. Whatever you think you found, it's not just yours, Harper. People in town would see it that way. There's a moral question here. Moral question. The words almost made me laugh. I asked him what history he was referring to exactly. Ryan, who could never resist showing he knew more than me, slipped just enough. Dad told me the real story about the Whitaker place years ago. Grandpa handled it fair and square. He had no idea I was holding the actual promissory note and transfer papers in my safe deposit box, the ones that proved their version was a carefully maintained lie. I filed that moment away like another entry in my ledger. Then came my parents. They arrived together on a Sunday afternoon, my mother carrying her famous chicken casserole like a peace offering. My father walked the lot slowly, studying the house with new eyes, not contempt this time, but calculation. Good frontage, he muttered mostly to himself, always was. Over coffee on the porch, they started the familiar dance. A property like this is too much for one person, my mother said gently. There are tax angles, liability angles. We could fold it into holdings, protect you on the paperwork. Protect me. 3 weeks earlier I had been a hopeless failure digging through family trash. Now they suddenly wanted to protect me with a quitclaim deed. I asked them directly where they had heard the property might be worth protecting. My mother's eyes flicked to my father for just a second. That was all the answer I needed. Travis had talked. And the Langfords had decided this forgotten farmhouse was suddenly worth reclaiming. If you've ever watched your own family shift from dismissing you to trying to control something you own, you know how surreal and painful that moment is. They weren't angry yet, they were strategic. They still believed I was the same daughter who would eventually fold under pressure and do the right thing for the family. I stayed calm, I smiled, I thanked them for the casserole, but I didn't budge an inch. That night, after they left, I sat in the quiet kitchen and felt something solidify inside me. The laughing had stopped, the ruddled no, the Langfords, had decided the farmhouse was worth taking. Which meant they would come at me with everything they had. But I had been preparing too. While they were making phone calls and spreading quiet concern around town, I was building my defense the only way I knew how, with paper. Clean, undeniable, meticulously organized paper. The Founders' Day Gala was coming in a few weeks. My father was set to be named Citizen of the Year, the biggest night in Maple Ridge. I already knew they would try to use that stage as their trap. They wanted me to stand beside them, smile for the cameras, and publicly hand over my discovery for the good of the family. I let them keep thinking that plan would work. Because while they were focused on controlling the narrative, I was quietly signing documents that would make their story impossible to sell. Stay with me, because the pressure was about to go public, and I was preparing the one thing they had never learned to fight against, an unbreakable wall of truth on paper. For the next 2 weeks I moved in complete silence. While my family was busy whispering in town and making strategic phone calls, I was building something they couldn't tear down with words, threats, or casseroles. I built a wall of paper. The first thing I did was sign the official consignment agreement with the auction house in Chicago. It was a real binding contract with a set auction date. The collection would be sold publicly under my name only, with full provenance documented. I read every line twice, the way I always had with important numbers, and then I signed it with a steady hand. That single document meant the treasure could never quietly disappear into family holdings. Next, I met with the lawyer I'd found 2 counties over. He had no ties to the Langford name, no golf games with my father, no history with my brother. After reviewing everything, my clean deed, the title chain, the contents of the strongbox, and the authentication reports, he gave me a clear written opinion. The property and everything inside it belonged to me alone. No family claims could stick. I paid him from the last of my savings and filed that letter like it was gold. Then came the partnership. I had been talking quietly with a developer named Marcus Sutter from the next county. He had wanted to restore historic properties in Maple Ridge for years, but had always been blocked by my father's influence. When I showed him the farmhouse and the vision for turning it into a beautiful heritage inn and event space called Whitaker House, his eyes lit up. We signed a letter of intent that clearly stated my ownership on the first page. His team would handle the restoration. I would keep majority control. It was the kind of justice I didn't have to force. It simply felt right. Every signature became another tab in my folder: deed, title opinion, auction consignment, legal letter, partnership agreement. And at the very back, the 1946 promissory note and 1947 transfer papers with my grandfather's signature. I organized it the way I used to organize audits: clean, logical, impossible to argue with. If you've ever had to protect yourself from the very people who were supposed to love you, you know how lonely that quiet preparation feels. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by documents, wondering if I was doing the right thing. The old fear was still there, the voice that said I was betraying my family, that I would end up even more alone. But then I would touch the folder and remember the steel door, the strong box, and the lie they had lived on for decades. That fear slowly turned into something steadier, something like resolve. Meanwhile, the pressure from my family grew. My father started telling people around town that his troubled daughter had stumbled onto something valuable, and the family was helping her manage it responsibly. Ryan hinted to business associates that there were questions about how I had come to own Langford ground. The story they were crafting was warm and familiar, the kind of story this town had always wanted to believe about our family. They were good at stories, they had built their entire name on one. But stories are just noise until they meet paper, and I had the paper. Every time the whispers got louder, I added another document to the folder. I stayed off their radar as much as possible. I worked during the day with the windows covered, met with Sutter after dark, and kept my answers short and polite whenever family called. I was no longer the girl who argued or cried or tried to explain herself. I was the woman who prepared. By the time the invitation to the Founders' Day Gala arrived, heavy cream paper, formal lettering, I was ready. My mother dropped it off in person. She stood in my doorway and told me my father wanted me on stage with the family. He was going to speak about new beginnings and the Langfords coming together around the old farmhouse. It would mean everything to him if I did the right thing in front of everyone. I looked at her and said I would come. She looked relieved. She thought the trap had worked. What she didn't know was that I had already decided exactly what I would bring with me to that stage. Not anger, not loud words, just one envelope containing copies of everything that mattered. I wasn't going to shout. I was going to let the truth speak in a room too polite to interrupt it. The night before the gala, I laid every page out on my kitchen table one last time. I checked every date, every signature, every stamp. Then I placed them carefully into the envelope, zipped it into my bag, and went to bed early. To my own surprise, I slept deeply. For 34 years, they had told me I couldn't see the big picture. Tomorrow night, on the biggest stage in Maple Ridge, I would show them that sometimes the clearest view comes from standing quietly in the truth. Stay with me, because the gala was never going to be the celebration my father expected. It was going to be the night the foundation of the Langford name finally cracked open in front of the whole town. The invitation came on heavy cream paper with gold lettering, the kind of formality my family only used when they wanted to remind everyone of their status. My mother delivered it herself, standing in my apartment doorway like she was afraid to step fully inside. "Your father wants you on stage with the family," she said, smoothing her coat. "He's going to talk about new beginnings and how the Langfords are coming together around the old farmhouse. It would mean everything to him to have you there, doing the right thing in front of the whole town." I asked her quietly what the right thing meant exactly. She met my eyes for a moment and said, "Letting the family handle the property, saying so kindly where people can hear it, putting this whole situation to rest." So that was the script they had written for me. My father would accept his Citizen of the Year award, then announce that the discovery at the old farmhouse was being brought back into the family fold, with his daughter's full blessing. I would stand there smiling like the prodigal daughter returning home, and the town would clap politely while the Langford name stayed intact. It was a good trap, clean, public, almost impossible to escape without looking like the ungrateful, unstable daughter they had spent weeks describing to anyone who would listen. I told her I would come. She looked relieved, even a little surprised, and left thinking the matter was settled. What she didn't know was that I had already prepared my own envelope. Inside were clean copies of the most important documents: my recorded deed with the county stamp, the auction consignment agreement, the lawyer's title opinion, and the 1946 promissory note with my grandfather's signature. I didn't plan to raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had learned long ago that in my family noise belonged to them. The truth, when presented calmly and with proof, was much louder. The night of the Founders' Day Gala, the old Elks Hall on Main Street was filled with 200 people. White lights, strung across the low stage, long tables covered in linen, the smell of coffee and baked chicken in the air. The mayor was there, county commissioners. The publisher of the Maple Ridge Sentinel sat near the front with a photographer. I noticed a quiet man in a gray suit sitting a few tables back, holding a leather folio. The auction house had sent their representative exactly as I had requested. I wore a simple deep green dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention before I was ready. My mother seated me at the family table near the front where everyone could see us reunited. My father worked the room like the king he believed he was, shaking hands, remembering names, smiling that practiced smile. Ryan stood at his side in a new suit. My mother glowed with pride. To anyone watching, we looked like the perfect family the town had always admired. Under the table, my hands rested on the bag in my lap. The dinner passed in a blur I barely tasted. Toasts were made. Then the chamber president stood and began the speech about my father, the boy who built an empire from nothing, the man who shaped Maple Ridge for decades. The room rose to their feet when they called his name. I stood with them, calm as still water. My father took the plaque, let the applause wash over him, then raised his hand. He thanked the town, told the familiar story of my grandfather arriving with nothing and building something lasting. Then his eyes found me at the family table and his voice warmed. "This town knows our family has had a challenging season," he said. "My daughter Harper took a big chance on the old farmhouse. A lot of folks thought she was being foolish." A soft, knowing laugh moved through the hall. But Langfords don't quit on each other, and what she found out there belongs to all of us, to this town's history. So tonight I'm proud to say the discovery is coming home where it belongs, into the family with my daughter's blessing. He let the words land, applause started to build, then he did exactly what I knew he would. He extended his hand toward me and said, "Harper, honey, come on up here and say a few words." 200 faces turned, cameras lifted, my mother beamed with certainty, Ryan watched with careful eyes. I stood up. I walked the 3 steps to the stage in my deep green dress, calm and steady. My father handed me the microphone with the smile of a man who believed he had already won. I took it. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice warm and even. Then I reached into my bag for the envelope. I took the microphone and looked out at the 200 faces watching me. The room was completely still. My father stood beside me, still smiling that victorious smile, completely unaware that the ground was about to shift beneath him. "Thank you, Dad," I said again, my voice calm and warm, carrying clearly through the hall, for giving me this moment. I reached into my bag and pulled out the manila envelope. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and began laying documents on the podium one by one. "First," I said, holding up the top page, "I bought the old farmhouse myself with my own savings, every dollar. It's recorded at the county under my name only, no cosigners, no family money. Here's the stamped deed." I placed it on the podium where the front rows could see it clearly. The room had gone very quiet now, the good kind of quiet, the kind where people lean forward. "Second," I continued, "what I found in a hidden chamber beneath the house is a significant collection of Depression-era gold coins, currency, and financial instruments. It has been fully authenticated with an unbroken chain of provenance. It's going to public auction in Chicago next month under a contract I've already signed. Here's that agreement." Another page went down, cameras started clicking. My father's smile was still frozen on his face, but it no longer reached his eyes. "And third," I said, my voice remaining steady, "the part that's really about our family." I unfolded the final pages. I looked directly at my father, not with anger, but with the quiet clarity of someone who had finally stopped being afraid. When I was searching for the paperwork to prove where these items came from, I found the original records. A promissory note dated 1946, written in Grandfather Harlan's own hand, and a bill of transfer from 1947. Stapled to them is the county notice showing how the assets moved. I held the copies up so the room could see. "My grandfather didn't just save the Whitaker property through honest business, Dad. He loaned a dying man money on predatory terms, then seized the land, the house, and everything hidden in that vault when he couldn't pay. That's where the Langford legacy actually began, with a calculated takeover hidden behind steel and concrete for decades." The silence in the room became absolute. My father's face changed, the color drained from it. "That's a lie," he said, his voice too loud, stepping toward me. "Put those down, Harper, put them down right now." Ryan was on his feet at the family table, his face red, saying my name like a warning. My mother had one hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. I stayed exactly where I was, calm as still water. It's not a lie, I said gently. The foreclosure and transfer are recorded at the county courthouse. Anyone can pull them on Monday. The originals are in a safe deposit box. And the gentleman in the gray suit 3 tables back is from the auction house. He can confirm the collection is exactly what I say it is. The man in the gray suit stood up. In the dead silence, his voice carried perfectly. I can confirm the consignment is signed and the provenance is fully documented, he said. The sale will proceed as scheduled under Ms. Langford's name. The publisher of the Sentinel was writing furiously. Cameras flashed. My father reached for the documents on the podium. I slid them just out of his reach, not aggressively, but firmly. Those are copies, I said quietly. The originals are safe. Ryan pushed forward toward the stage, his voice cracking. You think this is over? We'll have lawyers on this by Monday. There are family claims. There's nothing, I interrupted, still calm. I bought it. I own it. Everything I have I can show on paper. Every dollar, every signature, every date. Can you? He opened his mouth, then closed it, because we both knew what his paper looked like, the kind that had my initials on questionable entries back in 2019. For the first time in our lives, the silence was on his side of the table. My mother had slowly sat back down, staring at my father like she was seeing the foundation of her life crack open for the first time. My father stood there holding his Citizen of the Year plaque in one hand and grasping at copies he couldn't control with the other. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. 34 years of being told I was nothing had prepared me for this moment better than any speech could. I set the microphone back in its stand. I gathered the copies into a neat stack and slid them back into the envelope, unhurried, the same way I used to close a finished ledger. Congratulations on the award, Dad, I said plainly. You did build a lot, that part is true. Then I walked down the 3 steps, past the family table, past my mother's stunned face and my brother's red one, past 200 people who had come to celebrate the Langford name and were now learning what it was really built on. Nobody clapped, nobody booed, they just watched me go in complete silence. Outside in the cool night air, I stood in the parking lot for a moment and breathed. The faint smell of old oak and earth still clung to my coat from days of work at the farmhouse. It no longer smelled like failure, it smelled like ground I had dug up honestly and claimed as my own. I got in my car and drove out to the farmhouse, my farmhouse, and sat in the gravel lot with the engine off, looking at the old building under the moonlight. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the Langford who failed. I felt like a woman who finally owned exactly what she stood on. The auction in Chicago brought in $1,870,000. The historically significant pieces, especially those tied directly to Elias Whitaker's private bank records, drew serious bidders from across the country. I watched the numbers climb on my laptop screen in the quiet of my apartment, not with wild celebration, but with a deep, steady sense of release. It wasn't just money. It was proof that the truth, when properly documented, has power. A few months later, the restored farmhouse opened as Whitaker House, a beautiful heritage inn and event space. The old porch was rebuilt strong and welcoming, new windows let in soft morning light. The hidden chamber was carefully preserved behind glass as a small museum, telling the full story with Elias Whitaker's name first and foremost. The old steel door stands there as a quiet reminder of what had been hidden for so long. People from Maple Ridge and beyond started driving out again just to see it. What my family once called a worthless money pit had become something honest and meaningful. My mother came to visit once, a few weeks after the grand opening. She arrived alone. I watched her walk slowly through the bright restored rooms, touching the smooth wood counters, pausing for a long time at the glass overlooking the cellar. She read the plaque with Whitaker's name. Then she found me in the small office I now kept at the back. "The family misses you," she said softly. "You've made your point, Harper. It's not too late to come back, to stand with us again." I looked at her, really looked, and felt something tender but firm settle in my chest. The old pull was still there, the lifelong habit of wanting to make peace, but I had changed. "The door is never locked, Mom," I told her gently. "It never was. You can come here any time. But I'm done asking for permission to be worth something. I'm done shrinking so the Langford name can stay comfortable." She stood there for a moment, her eyes glistening. She didn't argue the way she once would have. Instead, she touched my arm lightly at the threshold, not grabbing, just a quiet acknowledgement. It was the most honest moment we had shared in years. She stayed for a cup of coffee, and when she left, the silence between us felt less like distance and more like respect. "If there's one thing I want you to carry away from my story, it's this. Your worth was never theirs to give or take away. Sometimes the very thing your family calls your biggest mistake, your hopeless failure, is exactly where your real life begins. The ground they told you to stay away from might be the place where you finally stand tall. If you've ever had to choose between keeping fake family peace and protecting your own dignity, drop the word boundaries in the comments below. Let me know I'm not alone. If this story touched something deep inside you, share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength and careful preparation can win against decades of noise. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. Protect your peace, trust your own careful heart, and never be afraid to open the door they told you should stay sealed forever.